The War of the Spanish Succession was a major European conflict of the early 18th century, triggered by the death in 1700 of the last Habsburg King of Spain, the infirm and childless Charles II. He had ruled over a large active empire which spanned the globe, and the question of who would succeed him had long troubled ministers in capitals throughout Europe. Attempts to solve the problem by partitioning the empire between the eligible candidates from the royal houses of France, Austria, and Bavaria ultimately failed, and on his deathbed Charles II fixed the entire Spanish inheritance on Philip, Duke of Anjou, the second eldest grandson of King Louis XIV of France. With Philip ruling in Spain, Louis XIV would secure great advantages for his dynasty. But some statesmen regarded a dominant House of Bourbon as a threat to European stability, jeopardizing the balance of power. Louis XIV had good reasons for accepting his grandson on the Spanish thrones, but he subsequently made a series of controversial moves. He sent troops to secure the Spanish Netherlands, he sought to dominate the Spanish-American trade at the expense of English and Dutch merchants, and he refused to remove Philip from the French line of succession, thereby opening the possibility of France and Spain uniting under a single powerful monarch at a future date. To counter Louis XIV's growing dominance, England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria, together with their allies in the Holy Roman Empire, reformed the Grand Alliance and supported Emperor Leopold I's claim to the whole Spanish inheritance for his second son, Archduke Charles. By backing the Habsburg candidate, each member of the coalition sought to reduce the power of France, ensure their own territorial and dynastic security, and restore and improve the trade opportunities they had enjoyed under Charles II. The Russians, who would otherwise be expected to help their Austrian allies, were occupied fighting another great war with Sweden that embroiled much of the rest of Eastern Europe. The English, the Dutch and the Austrians formally declared war in May 1702. By 1708 the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy had secured victory in the Spanish Netherlands and in Italy, and had defeated Louis XIV's ally, Bavaria. France faced invasion and ruin, but Allied unity broke first. With the Grand Alliance defeated in Spain, and with its casualties mounting and aims diverging, the Tories came to power in Great Britain in 1710 and resolved to end the war. French and British ministers prepared the groundwork for a peace conference, and in 1712 Britain ceased combat operations. The Dutch, Austrians, and German states fought on to strengthen their own negotiating position, but defeated by Marshal Villars they were soon compelled to accept Anglo-French mediation. By the terms of the Treaty of Utrecht and of the Treaty of Rastatt, the Spanish Empire was partitioned between the major and minor powers. The Austrians received most of Spain's former European realms, but the Duke of Anjou retained Peninsular Spain and Spanish America, where, after announcing his claim to the French succession, he reigned as King Philip V. The European balance of power was assured. A small number of historians, in retrospect, consider the War of the Spanish Succession to have been the first true world war in human history, having taken place over 2 centuries before what is commonly named World War I. Background: in the late 1690s, the declining health of King Charles II of Spain brought to a head the problem of his succession, a problem which had underlain much of European diplomacy for several decades. By the late 17th century, Spain was no longer a hegemonic power in Europe, but the Spanish Empire, essentially a vast confederation that covered the globe, which Spaniards usually referred to as a monarchy, remained resilient. Besides Spain, Charles II's other European realms comprised the Balearic Islands, the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Sicily, Naples, Sardinia, Finale and the state of Presidio on the Tuscan coast. Overseas realms included the Philippines, the Spanish West Indies, Florida, and much of North and South America and several North African cities. The empire was in decline, but remained the largest of the European overseas empires. and was still active and influential on the European and global stage. Charles II had become king following the death of his father, Philip IV, in 1665. But he was physically weak and incapable of having children. He was the last male Spanish Habsburg, and he had survived longer than anyone had expected. When the Treaty of Ryswick brought an end to the 9 Years' War, European statesmen turned their attention to solve the problem of the Spanish succession before the death of Charles II should actually take place. Ultimately, the main rivals for the Spanish inheritance were the heirs and descendants of the Bourbon King Louis XIV of France, and the Austrian Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, both of whom were sons-in-law to Philip IV of Spain and grandsons of Philip III, and both firmly believed in their claims. However, the inheritance was so vast that its transference would dramatically increase either French or Austrian power, which, due to the implied threat of European hegemony, was of the utmost importance to Europe as a whole. Rival claimants. Unlike the French throne, the Spanish thrones could all be inherited by or through a female in default of a male line. The next in line after Charles II, therefore, were his two sisters, Maria Theresa, the elder, and Margaret Theresa, the cadet. Maria had married Louis XIV in 1660, and by him she had a son, Louis, Dauphin of France. If it had been a matter of hereditary rights, the Dauphin would have been heir presumptive to the Spanish monarchy. But Maria had renounced her claim of succession in return for the payment of a dowry of 500,000 gold crowns. The testament of her father, Philip IV, reiterated this waiver and bequeathed the reversion of the whole of the Spanish dominions to his younger daughter, Margaret. However, the French, using in part the excuse that the dowry promised Maria was never paid, insisted that her renunciation was invalid. Nor was it clear whether a princess could waive the rights of her unborn children. Leopold I married Margaret Theresa in 1666. At her death in 1673 she left one living heir, Maria Antonia, who in 1685 married Max Emanuel, Elector of Bavaria. Shortly before her death in 1692, she gave birth to a son, Joseph Ferdinand. When she married, Maria had formally agreed to waive her rights to the Spanish thrones in favor of Leopold I's sons from his third marriage. The elder Archduke Joseph, who would succeed Leopold I as Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of the Austrian Habsburg lands, and the younger Archduke Charles, who Leopold I promoted as the candidate for the Spanish succession. However, the waiver imposed upon Maria Antonia was questionable and not recognized in Spain, where, instead, the Council of State welcomed the prospect of Joseph Ferdinand, a great-grandson of Philip IV, inheriting the entire empire. The Bavarian claim also attracted support from the maritime powers who, despite guarantees to Leopold I for the Spanish succession in alliance treaties of 1689, recognized that the House of Wittelsbach offered no threat to the balance of power in Europe. If he chose, Louis XIV could attempt to assert his will on Spain by force of arms. But the 9 Years' War had been an immense drain on France's resources. Moreover, Leopold I's war with the Ottoman Turks in the Balkans was nearing a successful conclusion, and the emperor would soon be in a position to transfer his energies west and bolster his claim to the full Spanish inheritance. To seek a satisfactory solution and gain support, Louis XIV turned to his long-standing rival William of Orange, who was both Dutch stadtholder and King of England. England and the Dutch Republic had their own commercial, strategic and political interests within the Spanish Empire, and they were eager to return to peaceful commerce. However, the maritime powers were in a weakened state and both had reduced their forces at the conclusion of the 9 Years' War. Louis XIV and William III, therefore, sought to solve the problem of the Spanish inheritance through negotiation, based on the principle of partition, to take effect after the death of Charles II. Partition treaties. The first partition treaty, signed by the Duke of Tallard and the Earl of Portland on 26 September 1698 and ratified on of October, allocated Naples and Sicily, the Tuscan ports, Finale, and the Basque province of Gipuzkoa, to the Dauphin of France, Leopold I's second son, Archduke Charles, would receive the Duchy of Milan and its dependencies. However, the bulk of the empire, most of peninsular Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, Sardinia, and the overseas territories, would transfer to the Bavarian prince, Joseph Ferdinand. Under Joseph, the Spanish monarchy would remain independent from either French or Austrian control, but his premature death in February 1699 necessitated the drawing up of a second partition treaty, the preliminary of which was signed between William III and Tallard on the 11th of June, then later ratified by the States General on the 25th of March 1700. The Spanish Empire was now divided between the three surviving candidates. By this new treaty, Archduke Charles would receive most of Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, Sardinia, and the overseas empire. The Dauphin would acquire Gipuzkoa, as well as the rest of Spain's Italian possessions, on the understanding that Milan would be exchanged for the Duchy of Lorraine, which in turn would be incorporated into France. For Leopold I, however, control of Spain and its colonial empire was less important than Italy, in particular Milan, which he regarded as essential for the security of Austria's southwestern flank. Although Leopold I and his ministers were willing to accept some sort of partition, they would not agree to a deal that shut the Austrians out of Italy. Leopold I, therefore, opposed the Second Partition Treaty. This was due in part to an adherence to Habsburg dynasticism, but by opposing the division of the Spanish monarchy, the emperor also hoped to create a favorable impression in Madrid, where the idea of partition had been received with consternation. Uppermost in the minds of the Spanish ministers was the need to preserve their empire intact and put it in hands powerful enough to guarantee that integrity. The preservation of the whole empire for the next generation of Spaniards was the driving motive in the last months of Charles II's life. But the grandees, led by Cardinal Portocarrero, knew that militarily their country was at the mercy of neighboring France and that Austria, lacking a navy, could not hope to validate its claims. Consequently, Charles II, pressed on his sickbed by his ministers, signed his final will on 3 October 1700, annulling the renunciations imposed on Maria Theresa and fixing the entire inheritance on the younger grandson of Louis XIV, Philip, Duke of Anjou. As Philip was not immediately in line for the French throne, the Spanish government hoped that this arrangement would be acceptable to European states who feared the unification of the French and Spanish thrones under a single monarch. If Philip should die or refuse, the offer was to extend to his younger brother, the Duke of Berry. If they both refused, the undivided inheritance would be offered to Archduke Charles. King Charles II of Spain finally died on 1 November 1700. Louis XIV now faced a dilemma which he himself recognized as intractable. If he forbade the Duke of Anjou to accept the Spanish thrones and instead adhered to the Second Partition Treaty, which Leopold I had refused to sign and the Spanish had refused to recognize, Archduke Charles would almost certainly be acknowledged as the King of Spain and all its dominions, as stipulated in Charles II's last will. The Austrian Habsburgs would accrue enormous power while France would gain nothing, and war with both Spain and Austria would be inevitable. Accepting the will of Charles II would also mean war with Leopold I. But in this case France would be allied with Spain, defending rights recognized in the Spanish monarchy. In any event, the French king surmised that the maritime powers, anxious themselves for peace, would be either neutral or only half-heartedly involved, so long as the French and Spanish crowns were not united. With this reasoning, Louis XIV decided to accept Charles II's last testament, and sent his grandson to Madrid to reign there as King Philip V of Spain.